Hello again, welcome back to IndyCar on the 26th of February, so last day of the week. Now, I know you haven't seen very much of me recently. Programs are a little bit spaced out, but that is unfortunately because I'm a little spaced out as well with so much work on my plate at the moment. However, I have some interesting, I think, stories for you today to talk about. The first one is, I think, one of the stranger stories that I've heard, and this was passed to me by one of my alert viewers, who brought up the subject of the Queen. Now, obviously the late Queen is not here to talk about this, but according to my alert viewer, in 1973, when the then Tory Prime Minister Ted Heath took the United Kingdom into what was then known as the EEC, the European Economic Community, or what we used to call the Common Market, there was a problem, and apparently the problem was with the monarchy. And because of certain rules and regulations for the commercial activities which the United Kingdom was wanting to take part in, shall we say, with trade with the EEC, it was necessary for the Queen to stop being the monarch, basically, to stop being the Queen of a kingdom. And in order to satisfy these regulations, the Queen was required to basically change her job description from being the Queen of the United Kingdom to being the head of the Royal Corporation. Now, this is something I was unaware of, but apparently there is such a thing as the Royal Corporation, or what some of the royal family call the firm, which is basically the family business which the royal family has become. Now, what is interesting about this is that although the Queen isn't capable of committing treason, Ted Heath, by taking the United Kingdom into the EEC in 1973 without a referendum, technically committed treason. And that means, according to my viewer, and I will need to check this to be sure, that all laws passed in the United Kingdom since 1973 are null and void, because having committed treason and not given us a referendum on whether we wanted to enter the EEC or not before being taken into it, we were basically denied the opportunity to decide. And that means that because Ted Heath basically just took us in there without asking anybody's permission, that he committed treason, and therefore none of the laws which have happened since now apply. Now, I am pretty certain that people like QCs, for example, Queen's Counsels, will bitterly argue that this is not the case. This is just technicality and no such thing ever happened. But then again, it might well have happened, because various things have to change when you join the European, or as it is now, the European Union, and there are various things that have to be done and said and explained before you're allowed to join. And as I've mentioned on a number of occasions, the United Kingdom in 1960 actually lied about the state of the United Kingdom and Scotland's place within it, saying to the European Union and the European Commission that Scotland was in a voluntary union and could leave at any time. And the European Union had to accept this, which they did. And so, for all intents and purposes, the UK is regarded by the European Union as a single political entity, i.e. known as a country, which is why we have the problems we have at the moment. However, that's not the only story in today's news. Now, if you've been reading the news feeds across the internet, you'll probably know that in Australia there have been some sporadic bouts of vandalism of colonial monuments, notably one to Captain Cook and to Queen Victoria, which was vandalised with, I'm assuming, blood red paint by some, I presume, some activists who object to these colonial monuments still being present in Queensland. But is it possible that the very many, and there are hundreds of them, of colonial and British monuments all across Scotland could actually eventually be removed? Well, there are some plans afoot in various circles to go through the various procedures necessary to have that done, but that would require local people voting on whether certain statues, certain plaques, street names and so forth are actually to be removed or changed in some way with the local authorities. Now, I'm thinking about in Glasgow, there are many streets and monuments to various British or even English prominent figures. The one that springs to mind immediately for me is St George's Cross in Glasgow, which has a sandstone statue of the patron saint of England in the middle of it. That's the kind of thing we're talking about. But I don't know whether you guys would think that is a good idea or not. Perhaps it's something that would happen after Scotland becomes independent. But it is definitely a topic. We probably have more monuments to the British state and its royal family and its various figureheads and colonial figures, including, of course, many of the I would say, the merchants, particularly in Glasgow, who were involved in the slave trade. And perhaps some of these monuments really should be removed and perhaps put in a park by themselves, somewhere where they can be seen for what they are, a relic of history. However, moving on to more up-to-date topics, and if you are unfortunate enough to have passed a newsstand and read the front pages of the Daily Mail today, you would have seen a massive headline screaming Sturgeon's, what was it they called it, Sturgeon's foul-mouthed rant about her political opponents, something like that. And that raises a question of, is it appropriate for the private messages of any individual at all, who is perfectly entitled to hold any opinion they like about anybody, is it right that these should become public knowledge? Is there any reason why, for example, Nicola Sturgeon or Humza Yousaf should have their private comments plastered all over the daily papers? And I would argue that no, there isn't, because seen in the context of what happened during the COVID lockdown, there were many comparisons between the way the Scottish First Minister at the time, Nicola Sturgeon, and Boris Johnson handled the way that the lockdown was carried out. Now, as we know, Boris Johnson's party, I was going to say party as in political party, but I suppose we could say that is a double entendre for the partying that went on within the Tory party itself during lockdown. That was rightly investigated, and messages for that seem to have conveniently vanished. And Rishi Sunak claims that he hasn't got any of his WhatsApp messages because he changed phones and doesn't have access to them. Nicola Sturgeon, on the other hand, freely gave all that information to the inquiry. Although she had deleted these files from her own device, they would be stored on the cloud, and she gave access and permission for all of them. And as also has her her current successor, Humza Yousaf, has given permission for them to be used in the inquiry. But the inquiry's purpose is not really to find out whether there was some kind of malfeasance or misbehaviour or some incompetence in the Scottish government. It's really to show that the British media wants to go after the Scottish leadership because the English leadership looked so terrible. And in describing Boris Johnson as a clown, I'm leaving the profanity out here, and also describing various other people like Matt Hancock and Liz Truss in equally disparaging terms in private messages to friends, that doesn't mean anything. And it certainly doesn't mean that the First Minister was in any way being publicly rude to any of these individuals, but she obviously held her own opinions of them. And interestingly, the idea of publishing these profane comments on the media has backfired big time. In fact, most of Scotland's independent supporters have rallied to the First Minister's side and said it's made her more popular, not less, by revealing these private messages. So is it ever appropriate for particularly government ministers to have their private comments paraded in public? Well, I would say no, unless there is some evidence that they've behaved in a criminal way. And I think we can safely say that Boris Johnson fits right into that category, because he partied on, dude, all the way through the COVID lockdowns when the rest of us were separated from our loved ones, and many people died on their own without being allowed to have loved ones nearby. All the time Boris Johnson and his cronies were living it up with the champagne lifestyle. So in terms of who I think it is appropriate to look at the private messages of, I think they're barking up the wrong tree here. I know that Jason Leach and Humza Yousaf had some exchanges when Humza was the health minister, And they shared opinions about the people they were dealing with in Westminster, and I don't think anybody would blame them for doing so, because those people in Westminster they were talking about were precisely the same people who were enjoying parties while everyone else suffered. Now that brings me to a final piece of good news coming from Glasgow today. It's been revealed today in the news media, particularly in the National, that the famous graving docks, these are three Victorian-era dry docks positioned in Govan on the south side of the River Clyde in Glasgow. The main one, at least, has got planning consent to be reopened and reused as a working dry dock, which is great news for Govan because this is the start of a new redevelopment of an area which has fallen into disrepair over many decades. And the graving docks have not actually worked for something like 36 years. However, there are already historic ships lining up, including the Queen Mary, which at the moment is languishing nearby, waiting to have her engines refitted and her funnels and decks replaced once the dry dock is opened again. The final piece in the puzzle is the repair of the sea gate, which keeps the water out of the dry dock when they pump the water out and allows various engineers to get in at the ship's hull and to work on it in a dry surrounding. It's a testament to the construction of these dry docks that they're actually still usable after all these years. And of course there are two other smaller docks as well as the one which has got the planning consent so far. But it's not just the docks themselves which we brought into commercial use, providing obviously new badly needed jobs in Govan, but also hundreds of new homes and shops and public infrastructure are being planned for the area too, an area which badly needs regeneration right now. Anyway, that's it from me from IndyCar today, but I think, you know, there's always something interesting happening in the background, and the idea that Ted Heath committed treason in 1973 was something I honestly had never considered. The idea of demolishing monuments to colonialism and slavery, I think, is something which touches a nerve with many people in Scotland and is a constant source of embarrassment for many of us living in old Victorian cities. However, I think it may need to wait until we are independent before we actually take the final action to do it. But as I say, the good news regarding graving docks shows that some Victorian monuments are actually useful. And in this case, a dry dock is just what Glasgow's shipyard industry really needs. And I think this can only be a good thing. Anyway, that's it from me in IndyCar today. As usual, keep the faith. Also, keep contributing to this program if you can. I have actually just spoken with Facebook about introducing in-stream advertising to my live streams. It hasn't been decided yet, but you may see during these live programs interruptions for advertising. I know that's annoying, but at the same time, it helps provide some income for the programs and allows me to keep broadcasting more frequently without having to rely so much on your donations. But for the moment, try to keep the donations coming in if you can. I appreciate them and they do help me create more content. That's it from IndyCar today. I'll hopefully talk to you again on Sunday. In the meantime, have a great weekend. Bye for now.